for our fourth installment of our avert seminar series. So today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Kathleen Moore. And she joins us from Oregon State University, where she's a distinguished professor of environmental philosophy. She received her doctorate in philosophy of law at the University of Colorado. She's a highly accomplished writer, exploring our moral and spiritual connections to wet, wild places in books such as Holdfast, Riverwalking, Pine Island Paradox, and Wild Comfort. These books have earned her numerous awards, including the Oregon Book Award, the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, and the Sigurd Olson Nature Writing Award. She has been published in numerous magazines, including Orion, Audubon, Discover, The Sun, and the New York Times Magazine. She also serves on the board of directors for the Orion Society, Oregon Humanities Magazine, and the Island Institute. She has been the recipient of numerous teaching awards, including the OSU Alumni Distinguished Professor Award. We are honored to have her with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Laura, and for all of the hard work that you've done to put this all together. And thanks all to you for coming out here. I told the students that I didn't really think I should have to give this talk because I've been meeting with students all day and they've been asking me harder questions than I have ever encountered in my life. I have to tell you, you have the smartest group of students on the face of the planet. And thank goodness for the planet that you do. It's really quite wonderful. You know, they say that the cost of an ecological education, this is Aldo Leopold, of course, the cost of an ecological education is that you live alone in a world of wounds. And I thought, that is so not true. Yeah, the world is wounded, and yeah, we're living in it, but we're not living alone. There are so many bright, dedicated people who are working for the benefit of that wounded world that it is heartening, and it's a wonderful thing to be part of that community of caring. So thank you, thanks all of you, and my admiration for you. So I'm also honored to be here because I know that I'm among scientists, and I am a philosopher. I oftentimes find that when I self-identify as a philosopher, people, it's kind of a conversation stopper, as if I told them that I was an undertaker or something. And what I've discovered is that oftentimes people don't even know what a philosopher does. And in fact, when my daughter was a little girl, we were walking on the street. She might have been 5, and a woman came up to her and said, "This is your mom." Erin says, "Yeah." And she says, "What does your mom do?" "Oh, she's a philosopher." "Well, what is philosophy?" And Erin says, "Oh, it's just something women do." So I took Erin home and I said, "Okay, Erin, here's how it goes. You tell people, philosophy is a study of ideas, and ideas rule the world." So that's what she says. So let's start out by being a little philosophical about this, and let's give ourselves some distance from the issues that we face, and let's figure out what is essentially weird about the situation that we find ourselves in here. What is going on? And let's just imagine briefly that there are aliens that are flying towards Earth. Let's think about what the aliens might imagine and learn about us as they get closer. And let's figure out that these aliens are nervously approaching the planet, and they're coming in from the dark side, and under cover of the shadowed side of the planet, they immediately understand that the Earth is populated by creatures who love water. And they can see this by the way the lights line up along the edges of the continents and along the rivers. And they might even call us luminaria, hydrophilia, maybe, the creatures who love water. And as they get closer, they're going to realize that not only do these creatures on this earth love water, love the oceans, they're made of water, they're made of the oceans. And they discover the astonishing fact that they're of the sea, and that the blood in their hearts and the moisture in their minds and even the tears in their eyes, it's all one river and it all flows to the same sea. And that they discovered that the earthlings know this, and that it has deep meaning for them, a deep spiritual meaning. And the aliens come across, in fact, a piece from a funeral service from a woman named Rachel Carson. And they read it in their little lab meeting, and here's what they heard. For the sea lies all around us. The continents themselves dissolve and pass to the sea in grain after grain of eroded land. In its mysterious past, it encompasses all the dim origins of life and receives, in the end, after many transmutations, the dead husks of that same life. For all, at last, return to the sea, to Oceanus, the ocean river, like the overflowing stream of time, the beginning and the end. And so these scientists, these alien scientists, keep poking around, and they discover that not only are people made of water, not only do they love the water, but they flock to the sea. Can you see what that is? That's beach umbrellas. That's a beach in China, and there are people there going swimming. And they find out that not only do humans go to the sea, but they make little boxes, and they put sea stuff in them, because they have actually discovered that looking at the sea relieves pain. So here are the boxes that they put in dentist's office for people to look at. And then they sent sociologists down to actually do some spooking around about what people care about. And the sociologists found the Corvallis Gazette Times love ads, where people express what they're really seeking in 25 words or less every Saturday. And they learned what it is that people yearn for. People, quote, seek a soulmate for. What's the number one reason why people in Corvallis seek a soulmate? Walks on the beach. That's absolutely right. You win. 71%. 71% of the people seek, beyond anything else, a soulmate for long walks on the beach. It wasn't even close, the things that came along after that. Let's see. The long-distance runner-ups were in order. Seeking soulmate for romance, tattoos, cuddling, fishing, although my studies showed that no one liked to cuddle who also liked to fish. Did I mention tattoos? Yeah. Harleys, hand-holding, friendship, and vampires. You would not be surprised to learn that people, that they drew the conclusion that these creatures on Earth are in love with the oceans. They are deeply, irretrievably besotted. So the aliens were baffled by what else they found, and you can imagine the reports that were coming back. They treat their oceans and their oceanic life like dirt. In fact, they treat them worse than dirt, which they sometimes respect. And one alien saw a giant dredge that was scraping the bottom of the ocean and lifting this billowing cloud of torn lives. And another one saw a fisherman in a storm cut loose a gill net that was 100 leagues long, and it floated along, catching fish under those, or by their silver moon gills day and night, until the net dragged all the way to the bottom of the sea. And another one saw a boat fill its seine so full of pink salmon that the weight of the net coming aboard capsized the boat. They dump their garbage overboard. They empty their toilets into the sea. They pump oil into it. They cool it. They warm it. They change its very chemical composition. Ocean creatures die and die and die. You can imagine that they might ask. This very important scientific question. What, are they nuts? What's going on here? If this is love, what kind of love is this? And that's really the question that I want to explore today. What kind of love is this? And what kind of actions does this love call us to? Because I want to show how this is even thinkable, that we would do this kind of damage to what we love so deeply. And I want to pose the proposition that although the oceanic crises are economic crises and scientific crises and technological crises, they are fundamentally a moral crisis, and they call for a moral response. So let me talk a little bit, first of all, about how this can be a moral crisis. And I think it's especially important for students I met today and other students to think about this so that they understand that as they're doing their work on mussels or copepods, as they're doing their work on the various effects of warming and acidification on the ocean, that they are doing work that has profound moral consequences. And let me talk a little bit about that. I want to highlight 4 moral reasons why climate change and the oceanic crises are moral crises. A couple of years ago, my colleague Michael Nelson and I decided that we were going to set out and we were going to look for a moral consensus on climate change that would match the scientific consensus. So we asked 100 of the world's moral leaders, people all the way from Desmond Tutu to Sheila Cloutier to the moral leader, the Dalai Lama. We asked all these people, do we have an obligation to the future? And we put their arguments together into a book that we call Moral Ground. And from those arguments, I want to pick out 4 arguments for climate change that are based on their responses. Okay, so first of all, one of the things they said was that the ocean crisis, scientific crisis, a chemical crisis, so forth, is a human rights crisis. 1 out of every 7 people, you already know this, depend on food from the sea as a primary source of protein. Do the math, that's 1 billion people. Imagine if we have a collapse of seafood in the oceans, what the costs of that will be in terms of human suffering. That 1 out of every 10 people live in places that are going to be inundated by rising seas, perhaps some of you. And you imagine that massive displacement. You can imagine the refugee camps. You can imagine the possibility of education or thriving or any kind of self-determination. You can imagine the waterborne diseases. You can imagine the intense storms. The point is this, that if we have a right to life and liberty and security of person, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, and I would posit that if there is anything on which human beings can agree, it is these fundamental declarations of human rights to life, liberty, and security of person. If we have those, then the changes that the oceanic crisis and the climate crisis will bring about are going to cause the greatest violation of human rights the world has ever seen. So as Anna studies the copepods and the effects of climate change on those, to the extent that's the work she's doing, I hope I understood, and thinks about the role of the copepods in the chain of life, one of the things she has to be thinking about as she's doing that is what will be the effects of climate change, of this oceanic change on the prospects of people to enjoy the life that they have a right to live. Sheila Cloutier is the former chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and she does a very nice job of talking about climate change as a human rights issue. She says, there are unpredictable sea ice conditions. Glaciers are melting, creating rivers instead of streams. And now we have more drownings, where our hunters thought they could cross safely. And so it's starting to undermine the ecosystem, the very land, ice, and snow that we depend on for our own physical and cultural survival. What we are doing here is we are defending our right to culture, our right to lands traditionally used and occupied, our right to health, our right to physical security, our right to our own means of subsistence, and our rights to residence and movement. And as our culture is based on the cold, the ice and snow, we are, in essence, defending our right to ice. The human rights issue. Climate change is also an issue of justice. Here you have a picture of Cuba. It's not just that people will suffer. They're going to suffer unjustly in violation of any principle of justice or equitable distribution. It's not the people who are creating the problems that are going to suffer. One group is going to enjoy the presumed advantage, or at least the short-term advantage of the profligate use of fossil fuels, while another assumes the burden of that privilege. And who are these people who are being asked to absorb these consequences? They are, in fact, the people who have no ability to speak in their own defense. They are future generations. They are plants and animals. They are marginalized people, people who live on the margins of the continents and on the margins of the economy, and they are the children. So Thomas Friedman does a very interesting metaphor. He says, let us imagine that we live in the top of we live in a penthouse of a 100-story building. And every day we send workers down to the bottom of that building to take out a few bricks so that we can make our penthouse even more beautiful and more fancy. And every day they go down, take out some more bricks and bring them up to the top. And for a while, you can do that. For 10 days, 10 weeks, 10 years, you can do that. But at some point, you're going to introduce channels of emptiness so severe that the whole edifice will collapse. And they will bring down not only the people who are in the lower ranks, but they will bring down the people who are in the penthouse as well. So I would also submit to you that the oceanic crisis is a failure of reverence. This isn't the usual terms where people talk about climate change. But let me suggest that we do for a moment. I don't know if you believe that God created the oceans in all their lives, or whether you think that they're part of the flowering of the creative universe, but it doesn't matter. Either way, they call for reverence, and reverence calls for respect. So let's just say you do believe that it's God that created all the creatures of the sea. You know how it said in the beginning? Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. And the gathering together of the waters he called sea, and God saw that it was good. The point that I want to make is that God is not indifferent to God's creation. And God saw that it was good. I don't know if an omniscient God can grieve. And I don't know if an omniscient God can feel fury. But I can imagine God pressing his fist to his mouth to keep from crying out in the night and waking us up. And I wonder sometimes late at night, what is the sound of God weeping? Is it the sound we hear in the hurricanes? Is it the sound we hear in the crackling seas? Is it the sound we hear in the floods? But say you don't believe any of that at all. I can't say that I do either. But say you don't believe in divine creation, then this is maybe even more astonishing, these kind of creatures. That they would be the result of the creative energy of the universe, bringing all these things to life, bringing forth all these forms of life. What kinds of life are you studying? I've already talked to people who are studying pteropods and copepods and mussels. What are some of the other astonishing creatures you're studying? Sing them out.
Salmonids.
Another.
Humans.
Another.
Bacteria.
Good.
Pteropods.
Oh, are you studying? Who said that? Raise your hand. Oh, man. I'm a writer and I'm always looking for metaphors. And those little sea angels are the metaphor of the week for me. Okay, good. All these things, all these astonishing creatures are irreplaceable, and they're essential. They are beautiful and fearsome. They are beyond human understanding, I would say. They are crazy creative. And if the good English word for this is sacred, then I'm just happy with that word. Either way, the reckless destruction is a failure of reverence. And I want to say also that the oceanic crisis, the climate crisis, is a betrayal of love. Love of the earth, love of life itself, and mostly love of our children. It's a betrayal of their hopes. So here's what I believe. I want to say it straight and clear. In order to show people that it's possible to come into a science building and say straight and clear what you believe is true. I think it's wrong to take whatever we need from the land and the seas to support our comfortable, profligate lives and to leave for the future a ransacked and dangerous world. I think that's wrong. And to let it all slip away, whether it's through indifference or recklessness or whether because we're too busy to save it, to let it all slip away, the billions of years it takes to evolve that silver skin on the squid or the feathers of an albatross, that's a sin. And I would say, when to enrich themselves, powerful fossil fuel interests threaten to disrupt forever the great planetary cycles that support all the lives on Earth, I would say that's moral monstrosity on a cosmic scale. That's what I believe. People say, what's the use of saying those things? What's the use of standing here and saying as clearly as you can what you believe about what's right and what's wrong? They say people don't make changes based on that. People make changes based on money, not morals. And when they say that to me, I say that is a fundamental misreading of American history. And I would submit to you that when America has been able to make a sea change, an extraordinary change, a change on a dime, it's been because of a rising wave of moral affirmation. And if there's anything we need, it's people standing up and telling us what they believe. When you think about, say, you think about the American Revolution, it was an outpouring of expression of belief in those great principles about human equality and freedom, as well as other things. When you think about the emancipation of the slaves, when you think about the civil rights movement, it was based on people coming up and saying, this is what I think is right and this is what I think is wrong. And when enough of those people did that, then everything changed. And Martin Luther King stood up and he said, I have a dream. It wasn't an economic dream. It wasn't a dream about iPods. It was a dream about opportunity and justice and compassion for the children. You are probably, some of you, old enough to remember when people said hell no to the Vietnam War. So what's my point? My point is that the question that keeps me up at night is whether we can save ourselves without that same moral affirmation of the rights of future people and our duties of compassion and justice. So that's where I stand. That's the end of my introduction. So let's do the ethics here. Let's break this down into three parts and try to figure it out perhaps quickly. Three questions. How did we lose our way here? How will we create a new moral compass? And how are we going to get started in that new direction? Well, we all know that when it comes to how we lost our way, that our actions and our sense of what is right, our sense of what is even thinkable, rests on a worldview. And a worldview is a culture's answer to three fundamental questions of the human condition. What is the world? What is the human being's role in that world? And how then shall we live? So the answers to those collectively become a worldview. We come up with our answers and we live in those answers and we carry on great planetary experiments to see if we got it right. Now, what I would say is that this world has been embarked on a global scale experiment that's testing the worldview of the industrial growth economy. And that we're the subjects of this experiment, as is every creature on land and sea. There are no consent forms, there are no controls, there's no going back. So what is that worldview that we've been testing for the last couple hundred years? I would put it this way, that because we're children of the European Enlightenment, we've brought the world to this impasse by acting on a set of delusions, and we have names for them. First of all, we believe that humans are separate from the earth, and I gave you this picture because I want you to imagine that we picture a kind of dualism whereby we are this bright, shining, ethereal star, and we are supported by all this greenery, which is all the biota of the earth. We believe that there's this deep crack down the center of creation that separates us from the world. And we believe that that human beings are the only creatures of soul and spirit in this world, that the rest is just matter and dumb brutes. And that the universe was created for human use alone. The whole purpose of that tree is to support the star. And that everything derives its value from its usefulness to our purposes. And we talk that way, don't we? When we talk about sea angels and other kinds of things, the words we use are ecosystem services and natural resources and provisioning services, all indicating that these things are there for our use. We believe in what I call technologism, that through increasing knowledge and technology, we will be able to solve every problem that we create through technology and compass and harness the planet to our purposes. And because of our technological prowess, this is called human exceptionalism, we can make ourselves exceptions to the rules that govern all of the rest of creation. So we can destroy, as Rachel Carson warned us, we can destroy our habitats and still not destroy ourselves. And so for centuries we've been going on with this view. And so when the aliens ask how is this possible for them to act in such a way, then what is so morally corrosive about this world? When you look at that set of beliefs about the world, you wonder, how could it have been any other way? If this is what you believe, you probably will drive the world into ruin. Honestly, the results of the experiment are in, and they're definitive. We didn't get it right. We got it profoundly, disastrously wrong. And that a civilization based on the view that humans are fundamentally separate from the rest of creation is going to undermine the physical systems that support it. And honestly, you can smell the scorched brakes as we skid to a stop on that dead-end road. So how are we going to get a new compass to steer by? The key point comes from you all, you scientists, you ecologists, that now we understood the world very differently. We got it wrong before, thinking that it was individualistic, atomistic, dualistic, and so forth. We understand the world now very differently, that human beings are part of the earth and that we're deeply embedded in relationships of kinship. It's not a dualism, it's a holism. And perhaps you recognize this new kind of representation of the relation of humans. See the black dot over here and the rest of creation. So we have a kind of ontological holism, a new sense of the world as a whole. And the question is now, given that new view of the world, can we come up with an ethics that matches it? Where we understand that the well-being of the whole depends on the well-being of all, creative and strongly resilient, and that humans reach their full potential as members of communities of shared caring, and that we're dependent on the earth, and that there are many ways to be good. So let me lecture a little bit about that. When philosophers think about ethics, they think of it in terms of a timeline. An act isn't just a single point in time. An act begins in a set of intentions, and it moves through time to the act itself, and the act itself then moves through time to a set of consequences. Where you focus on that timeline tells you what moral theory you use. If you focus on, you say an act is right or wrong depending on its intentions or the motivations that started it, then you're working with a virtue theory. Then an act is right if it's in accordance with a set of virtues. And if you focus on the act itself, an act is right or wrong because of a certain set of characteristics of that act, then you have a duty-based ethic. If you focus on the consequences and say an act is right or wrong depending on its consequences, then you have a consequentialist moral theory, and that can be consequences for human beings, or it can be consequences for the world as a whole. Where are we now in our culture? Right over here in that tiny, tiny little corner. You see I've highlighted the anthropocentric consequentialist theory. There's a whole world of ethics out there. But we, managers of ecosystems, scientists, politicians, focus on only one small set of considerations, and that is, what are going to be the consequences of this act for human beings? And if the consequences of the act advance the interests of human beings, we call them good. And if they don't, then we call them bad. But what I want to suggest today is that we can go way beyond this, and we can start thinking about ethics in terms of the whole moral landscape, a kind of pluralism that invites us to think very differently about our obligations to the world. I gathered a group of people up in the Andrews Forest, up in the Cascade Mountains, to try to imagine what this new ethic might be. And if you know that I invited philosophers, you know that my problem as an organizer would be to get people to be quiet. So I said on the first night, everybody is allowed to say one sentence and only one sentence. And that sentence will be the answer to the question, how might we create a concordance between ecological and moral principles, and thus imagine an ethic that's of the earth instead of against it? What one sentence is going to help us think about that new kind of moral mimicry, a new kind of a civilization that aligns its ethics with the ways of the world. And what was interesting was that as we went around the circle, and all these 16 people said their one sentence, it all turned out to be pretty much many different forms of the same sentence. And that sentence was, to quote Aldo Leopold, "The first premise of any ethic is that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts." So that's our challenge, is to think about a community of interdependent parts and to base our ethic on our membership in that community so that we understand that the community is sea angels and sea lice and grunions and your grandchildren, and it's all one beautiful life-giving system. It's interconnected, it's resilient, it's finite, and it's heartbreakingly beautiful. How then will we act? And if we're on the verge of understanding that, then we're on the verge of a new ethic that I think can carry us forward. So let's see if we can take some steps forward. How are we going to get going in a new direction? First of all, let's get rid of some of the things that hold us back. There are about 4 beliefs here I want to talk about that get in our way every single time we try to think about how we as moral beings can cope with the oceanic crises and the climate crises. And the first one I'll represent with this chart, which is so familiar to all of you. And the first I would call self-defeating notion, with all due apologies, is that science is all we need. You know, scientists have done this really wonderful job, heroic job, of telling us that global consensus that climate change is real, it's deeply dangerous, and it's upon us. What has happened? Not much. So the scientific response, to speak more loudly, to speak more clearly, to speak more to the point, to take courses in communication. All good, but what has happened? Not very much. The problem is that scientists are working on an assumption that I think is false. In fact, I think you all are working on, scientists, I'll say, are working on an assumption that I think is one of the saddest phrases in the universe, and it is this: that if people only knew, they would act. If people only knew what we were doing to the planet, then they would act. If you believe that, then you're going to think that your job is to just pile on information so that people will finally know. But that's, I say, based on a logical and a practical error. And that what more can scientists do, which is a question I've been getting for the last couple of days, what more can scientists do is the absolutely wrong question. So let me show you why. This is the practical syllogism, and it comes from Aristotle. And it goes like this: that any argument that's going to reach a conclusion about what we ought to do is going to have 2 premises. The first premise is descriptive and empirical. It's based often on scientific evidence. This is the way the world is. Facts, data. But from a description of the way the world is, we can't reason to a conclusion about what we ought to do unless we have the additional second premise. And the second premise is a normative one. It's ethical. It's based on our values. It says, this is what we value, this is what we believe is right. This is how the world ought to be. If we know the way the world is and the way the world will be if we will continue on this way, and if we know the way we believe the world ought to be, then we can reach a conclusion about what we want to do. Barack Obama is very good at this. He was talking about stem cell research. Maybe you remember. He said, scientists tell me, there comes the first premise, scientists tell me that stem cell research can help to cure disease. Premise 2. My mama always told me that if you can help somebody, you should. Allowed him to reach the conclusion that we ought to relax controls on stem cell research. So here it goes. If we don't act immediately, this is what the scientists tell us, anthropogenic changes to the climate and the oceans will bring serious harms to the future. Data-driven. Doesn't tell us anything about what we should do. Nothing. Unless we also assume the moral principle that it's wrong to harm the future. And if we make that assumption, then we can draw the conclusion that we have a moral obligation to act to avert that harm. So what I'm suggesting is that the second premise, this work of the second premise, is equally important as the work of the first. And what we need is a great national conversation about our moral obligation to the future. does the work of the scientists do the work of the first premise. Who does the work of the second premise? It's the work of art and literature and storytelling. It's the work of religion. It's the work of philosophy. It's the work of civic community. It's storytelling in all its forms. It's the work of families. But in our culture, this work of wisdom is the work of the universities, and it is not getting done. So, what I'm calling for is a conversation, a public conversation about the second premise. What is our obligation to the future? What must we do? What ought we to do in order to be true to our values? Now, I want to point out one more thing about this, and that I think that this argument makes very clear the logic of climate denial. Because if you want to say that we don't need to do anything to stop climate change, in other words, if you want to deny the conclusion, you're going to have to deny one or two of the premises. Now, suppose you decide we're going to go after the second premise. That means you're going to have to say, I don't see any reason to think it's wrong to harm the future. I don't care about harming kids. I have no interest in my grandchildren. That's a tough public stance to take. Far easier to go ahead and deny the facts. So it seems to me that the people who are interested in stopping movement on climate change are going after the facts in order not to have to say what they really think, which is that they would really put their own profits ahead of the interests of future people and children. So to the extent that there is logic in climate denial, I would say that that's what it is. The second thing that I think we need to get past is this notion that we have met the enemy and he is us. And I want to be careful about this because it's tricky. You all have taken economics, so you know about the externalization of costs, right? That a company would try to get the public to pay the cost of its pollution. In other words, the more cost you can externalize or impose on other people, the better off your company is. What we're seeing these days is the externalization of shame. And it is stopping us in our tracks. And here's what I mean. It may be, I've been talking too much today. It may be that what we're seeing is one of the biggest triumphs of big oil is their ability to make consumers blame themselves for climate change, even while the corporations are spending billions of dollars to influence the decisions that we consumers make. That is really a cool plan, if you can get away with it, to make us blame ourselves, even as they're leveraging their bribes to Congress to be sure that we don't have any alternative ways to heat our homes or travel to our jobs or find our way to ease our grief. The point is, they're spending billions of dollars to convince us that and make sure that we have no other choice, and then they're blaming us for making that choice. And it happens again and again and again. And every time I hear somebody say, we have met the enemy and he is us, I just want to puke. I think that's the way. Or if they're not saying that it's our fault, we consumers' fault, then they're saying, oh, maybe we are changing the earth with climate change, but it doesn't do any harm. And maybe you remember that ad from some time ago. It was a Mobil oil ad. And it had a picture of the earth, this beautiful cloud-splashed earth, and underneath it said, Mother Earth is a tough old gal. Implying that, we can do a lot of damage to this earth before it does any damage. And I wrote to them. And I said, if the earth were your mother, she would grab you in one rocky hand and hold you underwater until you no longer bubbled. Maybe that's, of course, we should dramatically reduce our use of fossil fuels. That said, I didn't cut corners and cause an oil gusher in the Gulf of Mexico. And I didn't do my best to undermine the EPA and any other agency that might control fracking. And I'm not lobbying Congress to open oil drilling in the Arctic Ocean. And I didn't cut funding for alternative fuel sources. The point is that big oil is shaping government policies and consumer preferences every way they can, pouring millions of dollars into it and blaming us. So we've met the enemies, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it isn't me. But while big oil is externalizing all its other costs on me, I'm not going to allow them to externalize the moral culpability for its attack on the earth. So that's the second non-starter. The third is this notion that there's no hope or that there's no problem. And I ask my students on a hopeometer to indicate where they are, where 10 means we can do this, there's no big deal, we can solve this climate change ocean problem, or 0, there's not a chance. And I ask them to place themselves on this meter. And so let me ask you, if 10 is no problem and 0 is a problem, will you show me hands for people who are 10s? Are you 9s? Are you 8s? Are you 7s? 6? 5? 4? Sounds like a countdown. 3? 2? 1? 0. Interesting. It's fascinating. I've done this before. You are the most optimistic group I have ever met. I'm serious. How can that be? Interesting, interesting, interesting. Okay. My own view is that, oh, geez. Our options are limited. And every time I start to feel hopeful, I look again at what Gus Speth says. You know, Gus Speth, the former dean of Yale College of Forestry, said, you know, all we have to do to make sure that we leave a ruined world to our children is exactly what we're doing now. And I think, oh man, where are we going to find a hope? Now, this is the problem for a society that's built on utilitarianism. Because if we can't do any good, we can't do anything right. You see? If you judge the morality of your acts by their consequences, and if the consequences are going to be inconsequential, then it's impossible to act in a right way. So if we have no hope of doing anything, then we are going to do nothing, and that's a kind of moral abdication. But if we have hope and think that everything's going to be fine, then we don't have to do anything, and that's a kind of moral abdication. So we're stuck here between two alternatives of hope and despair, and it's very difficult to move forward. But the important thing to notice is that between hope and despair, which is a false dichotomy, is this huge moral ground, which I call integrity. It's the ground of integrity, not acting out of hope, not failing to act out of despair, but doing what you believe is right because it's right. Acting justly because you believe in justice. And what I think is really important is to understand that even in a time of extraordinary risk and extraordinary danger, we can live a life that is true to our own beliefs, that we can act gratefully because life is a gift. We can act reverently because the world is sacred. And we can act lovingly towards the ocean because we love it. So this means, I think, a fierce and tireless defense of the oceans against those who would wreck them. So how do we go forward in this new direction? One thing is that there's a positive and a negative, and the negative let's do first, because if the culture forces us to live in ways that we don't believe in, we have to change the culture. And we can do that in a negative way, which may be where we need to start. If we're going to live lives of integrity, matching what we do with what we think is right, then there are things we're going to refuse to do, understanding that there are costs to us of that refusal. So many of us were alive when people said, as I said, hell no to an unjust war. We can also say hell no to an unjust economic system. So what we have is James Hansen standing in front of the path of the Keystone Pipeline. We have the Sierra Club saying for the very first time ever that direct action is a legitimate environmental tactic. We have people standing up tomorrow or the next day in Washington to submit to President Clinton that they will not go along with exporting the tar sands across America. The point being that if we believe that there are opportunities for us to express our values by saying, I know what you want me to do, I know what you want me to eat, I know how you want me to travel, I know what you want me to invest in, but I don't believe in that, and I'm not going to do that. That's a real problem for scientists, I would say, because my student did a study of the climate footprints by department at Oregon State University. Which department do you think at Oregon State University has the largest climate footprint per capita? Oceanography. It's the climate change people who are traveling all over the world doing these beautiful studies. So I guess I just say that just so you have something to think about. And to point out that the choices aren't easy. But here's the thing, that every act of refusal is also an act of assent. Every time we say, no, I'm not going to do that, I don't believe in that, what we're really doing is saying yes to something that's more beautiful and sustaining. So that's the first step, is to get your own house in order. But we don't want that. We don't want something so grief-stricken. We're looking for something that's more joyous. And so what I recommend to students is to think about our opportunity to make our lives, as people of integrity, our opportunity to make our lives into a work of art that expresses our deepest values. So as we live with integrity, we can imagine and bring into existence new ways of living on the land that are bright with art and imagination, and nested into families and communities. So I would recommend to students that they ask themselves 2 questions. The first question is, what are my gifts? My Potawatomi friend says, the gift of the robin is the song, and its duty is to wake up the sun in the morning. And the gift of the salmon is its beautiful red flesh, and its work is to feed the people. If you know what your gifts are, you will know what your work is in the world. Ask yourself too, what are my joys? What are the things I really love to be doing? And then ask, what does the world need? Your work is at the intersection of your greatest joy and the world's deepest need. Your work is at the intersection of your greatest joy and the world's deepest need. Now I would say to science students, insist on being whole. I'm calling you to integrity. Insist on being whole. Don't let any professors cut your brain in half and throw half of it away, telling you that there's only one way to think, or that there's only one way to react to climate change. Be a whole person. Secondly, I would say, reach out to your colleagues in other fields. I was telling students today that maybe none of us can be Rachel Carson, because she brought together beautiful writing and deep scientific knowledge and a strong moral sensibility. But 3 of us could be Rachel Carson. We reach out and create Rachel Carson trios by talking to people who have abilities that we don't have. And maybe together we can do what we could never do alone. To understand that there are many kinds of integrity, of which scientific integrity is one. We also are called to integrity as a citizen of the world, as a force of nature. And then I want to say too, I want to call students to number 4, the notion that you don't need to let anybody silence your love. That loving is a way of acting in the world. And that an expression of love, even love that's linked up to your work, is an important part of making a difference in the world. So let me close by reading you selections from the essay that I wrote for my own book, which I hope would maybe be an example for what some of the things that I'm trying to say. It's called The Call to Forgiveness at the End of the Day, and its date line is May 25th, 2025. So you see I'm writing from the future, reflecting back on the 10 years subsequent to these. All those years, the Swainson's thrushes were the first to call in the mornings. Their songs spiraled like mist from the swale to the pink sky. That's when I would take a cup of tea and walk into the meadow. For years, there were flocks of goldfinches in the meadows. After my husband and I poisoned the bull thistles on the far side of the pond, the goldfinches perched in the willows. When they landed there, dew shook from the branches onto the pond, throwing light onto new leaves where chickadees chirped. The garbage truck backed down the lane, beeping its backup call, making the frogs sing even in the day. Oh, there was music in the mornings all those years. In the overture to the day, each bird added its call until the morning was an ecstasy of music that faded only when the diesel pumps kicked on to pull water from the stream to the neighbors' Bing cherry trees. Evenings were glorious too. Just as the sun set, little brown bats began to fly. If a bat swooped close, I heard its tiny radar sonar chips just at the highest reach of my hearing. Each downward flutter of its wings squeezed its lungs and pumped out another chirp the way a pump organ exhales a Bach. I don't know how many frogs there were in the pond then. Thousands, tens of thousands, clumps of eggs like eyeballs in aspic. Neighborhood children poked them with sticks to watch their jelly shake. When the eggs hatched, there were tadpoles. I have seen the shallow edge of the pond black with wiggling tadpoles. There were that many, each with a song growing in sight. Just at dusk, a hooded merganser would sweep onto the water. Sorry. In the years when the frog choruses began to fade, scientists said it was a fungus, or maybe bullfrogs were eating the tadpoles. When the bats stopped coming, they said that was a fungus too. When the goldfinches came in pairs, not flocks, we told each other the flocks must be feeding in a neighbor's field. No one could guess where the thrushes had gone. As it happened, that was the spring when our granddaughter was born. I brought her to the pond so she could feel the comfort I had known there for so many years. Killdeer waddled in the mud by the shore, but even then, not so many as before. By then, the pond had sunk into its warm, weedy places, leaving an expanse of cracked earth. Ahead of the coming heat, butterflies fed in the mud between the cracks, unrolling their tongues to touch salty soil. I held my granddaughter in my arms and sang to her then an old lullaby that made her soften like wax in a flame, molding her little body to my bones. Hushaby, don't you cry. Go to sleep, you little baby. I held her close. She fell asleep in my arms, unafraid. I will tell you, I was so afraid. Poets warned us, writing of the heartbreaking beauty that will remain when there is no heart to break for it. But what if it's worse than that? What if it's the heartbroken children who remain in a world without beauty? How will they find solace in a world without wild music? How will they thrive without green hills edged with oaks? How will they forgive us for letting frog songs slip away? When my granddaughter looks back at me, I will be on my knees, begging her to say, I did all I could. I didn't do all I could have done. It isn't enough to love a child and wish her well. It isn't enough to open my heart to a bird-graced morning. Can I claim to love a morning if I don't protect what creates its beauty? Can I claim to love a child if I don't use all the power of my beating heart to preserve a world that nourishes children's joy? Loving is not a kind of la-di-da. Loving is a sacred trust. To love is to affirm the absolute worth of what you love and to pledge your life to its thriving, to protect it fiercely and faithfully for all time. My husband and I were there when the last salmon died in the stream, although we didn't know it then. When we came upon her, her flank was torn and moldy. She had already pulled the rich red life from her muscles into her hopeless eggs. When she was dead, she floated with her tail just above the surface, washing downstream until she lodged on a gravel bar. The music she made was a riffle of rib bones raking water, and then no sound at all as her body settled to the bottom of the pond. I buried my face in my hands even as I stood in the water with the current shining against my shins. Oh, we had known the music of salmon moving upstream. When the streams were full of salmon, crows called again and again, and seagulls coughed on the gravel bars. Orioles sang, their heads thrown back with singing. Eagles clattered. Wading upstream, we walked through waves of carrion flies that lifted off the carcasses to swarm in our great tails, and pebbles rolled downstream. It was the crashing coda, the slam, and the buzz, and the gull scream. Ring the angelus for the salmon and the swallows. Ring the bells for frogs floating in bent reeds. Ring the bells for all of us who did not save the songs. Holy Mary, Mother of God, ring the bells for every sacred emptiness. Let them echo in the silence at the end of the day. Forgiveness is too much to ask. I would pray for only this, that our granddaughter would hear again the little lick of music, that grace note toward the end of a meadowlark's song. Meadowlarks. There were meadowlarks. They sang like angels in the morning. You have been very kind. Let me thank you by closing with a blessing. We won't have time for questions, but I will be in another room, and I would welcome any kind of conversation. So let me end this way. So I wish you balance. A balance like an albatross in flight, with every wing and feather, muscle, thought, and playful. Family and friends and work and wildness and well-being. Action and tranquility. I wish you work of substance and beauty and import. I wish you fresh wind blowing waves, sun through fog, and the time to stand in the weather breathing. I wish you perspective, which is the power to lift your eyes to the horizon, which is always bigger than what you hold in the hand. I wish you imagination, which is the gift that the universe has given us alone to envision life ways that are different from what they are now. I wish you courage. You are a beautiful gift that the world has given to itself. You are a force of nature. Truly, you are the Earth's last hope to save the beauty and richness of its oceanic lives.
Time for one or two questions. And just a reminder that next Monday we don't have school's not in session, but the next Monday after that, Chris Devine will be speaking in our series.